and welcome to another episode of the Star Sitdown. Today, I am with Ms. Arielle Raveney. She is the president of Students Against Violence. Hello, Arielle. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. A few technical difficulties. I'm happy we were able to make everything work and make the time work. But I look forward to talking to you and asking some questions about SAV. I know over this past year, with COVID and, I didn't notice because when I was in formerly like Men Against Violence, that's what it was known as. And I had met you briefly for a little bit and during the meeting. So I'm excited. Can you tell me more about Students Against Violence and just your involvement with the organization?
Yeah, for sure. So we were formerly Men Against Violence, but we changed that name due to like a number of reasons, mainly being we wanted to make it clear that we're open to all gender identities. We want to make sure also that like when we're having a conversation with individuals, like they don't get put off by our name. And so that's kind of why we changed it. We went through, it was a long process to get that changed. We did like a lot of, what are they called? Forums? But anyway, my involvement with Students Against Violence is that I'm the president. And the cool thing about our organization, I feel, is that we function in about two different ways on campus. So one of them being we do education through presentations and through events and other outreach. And then the second way we do it is through our club meetings, right? It's through our organization, and we meet every Monday at 5:15 p.m. Now it's on Zoom in this virtual world that we're living in. Yeah, so what my role is that behind the scenes, I do, I guess, leadership with my co-officers, right? Now, last semester, we had two other officers. In this semester, we only have one other officer. And so we plan meetings, we plan events. I would typically be giving presentations around campus, but because of COVID-19 and like safety regulations, we have just recorded a presentation that you can request on our website through the Student Health Center under the Students Against Violence tab.
How has it been during like the transition from obviously going to like in-person meetings to like, doing everything virtually and trying to be as safe as possible on campus?
Yeah, so I'm sure we're feeling what a lot of other organizations are feeling, which is, on one hand, I'm very grateful that we have technology like Zoom, that we can meet still virtually and still have those conversations. But it is sad, and I miss seeing the members, right? I miss that connection of being in a room with everybody and getting to have that, like, you get to have a lot more small talk, I feel like, when you have an in-person meeting. But it has been really nice to get to see the faces of individuals who are able to make it to our virtual meetings. And it has been different switching from having conversations in person to having conversations virtually, because we like to create a safe space, right? That's like our thing, is that we create a safe space for hard conversations over topics like sexual assault, over topics like domestic violence. And we kind of get into like the root and the system of it all as to like unpacking why it is that these things even occur. And there is just something different in a room full of people. You can feel each other's energy. You can kind of have that, like, I guess, more connection with each other. But we are doing it still virtually. We're still having those conversations. And, as time is going on, I feel like, I don't know if other people feel this way, but, it's been a year now of us doing things over Zoom, that it is starting to feel a little bit more like comfortable, I suppose. A little more comfortable than just talking to a box on a computer screen.
So what made you want to join the organization like Students Against Violence, and like why is peer education so important to you?
That's a good question. So I've been, I guess, like a feminist or whatnot, throughout high school and everything. I've been an activist for a lot of my life. And coming to college, I think it was just it's an important time to find your place, kind of. So it's funny, I actually went to a Men Against Violence meeting as like a wingman for my friend. And then I heard the topic and I fell in love and I loved it. And I just think that it's really cool. I never thought that a tool for activism could be education until I've started doing it. And I've realized like there is so much that happens in our world that is ignorance, right? And is also just like a lack of education, like something I think is super cool that we do, that I get to do through formerly Men Against Violence and now Students Against Violence, is have conversations with individuals that we should have had a long time ago, but we don't because of our education system, because of the way we teach sex education. I just fell in love with the idea of having these conversations in a way that isn't judgmental, in a way that is fully just, hey, like, let's talk about consent for the first time, you know? And it's like, it's invigorating. It's really exciting for us to have these conversations with incoming freshmen or with people in their classrooms or people inside our organization and just being like, hey, like, let's talk about what it means to have safe sex. Let's talk about what it means to have consent. Let's talk about what it means when somebody commits a hate crime, you know, and like, why is it? Let's unpack it and get to the root of that. And so that's what brought me, you know, that's what allured me to Men Against Violence. And then that's what made me stay and be an officer. I've actually been an officer since my freshman year. So this has been my whole college career with this organization. And it just, I don't know, it fulfills me.
So in your experience with this organization and talking to so many people and working in the student health center, do you feel that Texas State offers enough resources and spaces for LGBTQIA plus students?
I think that Texas State is a system, like a lot of things are a system, right? Of course, I believe that they could do better. But also at the same time, I think that something I really appreciate about Texas State is the freedom to create organizations. So while systematically, I'm sure there could be more protection or more thought for LGBTQ individuals, there are spaces allotted to them, right? There are organizations that are able to be on campus, that are given spaces to create safe spaces for other LGBTQIA individuals, which I think is, you know, a benefit and a great thing. And also we have the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which not every single college has, I don't think, you know? And so I think that there are steps being made to think about LGBTQI individuals, but I think in general, as a nation, as a society, we're still very early in our thought process of going past just accepting, right, LGBTQ individuals and going further to nurturing and just kind of building them up, right? I think we have, as a society, also just have a long way to go before that is something that is just regularly thought about and implemented.
Do you think the problem there is the ignorance of many people and like the lack of education and potentially their upbringing and unlearning like these behaviors of bigotry and ignorance?
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting to think about the unlearning process of everybody and also how that unlearning process needs to be reflected inside of systems, right? And so it can be easy to put a rainbow outside your door. It can be easy to like say that you're an ally and put it in your bio, right? But what matters is going, you know, further and going beyond of just saying, oh no, yeah, like I am fine with seeing two men hold hands, right? I think I completely agree that we do need to unlearn a lot of our internalized homophobia. I think that is something that even queer individuals have to do for themselves, right? Like we have to unlearn our internalized homophobia to even kind of accept ourselves sometimes. And I think in order to be a good ally, in order to really do all that, it's thought and it's also conversation, right? It's like not only do you have to unlearn your own bigotry, it's important that like as an ally, you also stand up and help others unlearn that, right? I think that there is something to be said about asking marginalized communities to do all the unlearning for other people. I don't think that is their responsibility. It's not the LGBTQIA's full responsibility to help people unlearn that, we have to unlearn that, and we also have to help other people unlearn that, right? So that could also be involved in the system. So that could be conversations around, like, whoever is in charge, whoever is responsible to protect students, right? Because that's the whole point. They need to also be having those conversations and pointing it out and holding other people responsible if there is homophobia and if there is ignorance, right? There should be more, I guess, active education around that.
Do you think that's why it's important to have safe spaces on campuses? Because you know, I never really understood the need for like a quote unquote safe space. I mean, and part of that is because of, being a straight guy and, and being around a lot of straight people and, going into college, I didn't have a lot of friends who weren't similar to me in some sense or another, and
Yeah.
in being in Men Against Violence and, when I was and learning and just like feeling myself around people, and truly why I went was just to like sit and listen. I wasn't really a talkative person. I was kind of just there. And, part of me is like, it's life, stuff happens. You have to deal with adversity. And like a lot of stuff is like, I don't want to say like necessarily like coddling, but it's like a lot of like nurture. And like how I was like raised and brought up was like you have to, especially being black and like dealing with racism, it's like it's part of it. This is what it is, and you can fight to change it, but like you have to deal with the adversity and move on and grow stronger. So I never really had like the safe space mentality. I wasn't really taught that. It was like, this is it. You have to face it. You have to learn from it. You have to grow from it. So I just want to get your perspective on like the importance of like a safe space and why it's necessary.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that, because the thing about safe spaces is that it's not just a term coined for LGBTQ individuals, right? That's coined for so many marginalized communities, including like Black individuals like yourself, And so what is beautiful and cool about safe spaces is that to some individuals, they might see it as coddling or, oh, this and that. But in reality, we have a society that coddles a very specific identity, and that's going to be straight, white, cis individuals, right? And so there need to be safe spaces in order to not only have these individuals be able to have a place to get to rest and have a place to like be truly who they are without being judged through that societal lens, but also it gives a space to celebrate, right? To celebrate like your Black culture, or to celebrate like what it means to be gay, what it means to like love a person who might not be on the binary, And I just think that the cool thing and the important thing about safe spaces is that it gives people a place to fully be themselves, which some people might never have gotten, right? Or which some people might all day have to put up this mask, pretend to be somebody they're not. They get to go to their safe space and they get to embrace who they are and they get to celebrate who they are. And that is why I truly believe safe spaces are important, because the things that you can nurture and grow in that safe space can then be brought out to society, right? When you feel comfortable, when you feel confident, like we can start implementing that, and we should start implementing that, because like our society should be safer for a lot of identities, and it's just not, right? It's just not. And so I think that safe spaces are important to start that growth.
So the idea of a safe space is more so about just feeling comfortable in an environment and just being able to be yourself. Like that's just the bottom line, and how it's able to apply to different groups and individuals for different reasons. So like it makes more sense now, like when you put it in that perspective in that way, because there's like many things, there becomes like an image and a connotation with a certain phrase or word. So that makes a lot more sense now. And this is part of why I wanted to have you on the podcast, was just like to have these conversations. And it's important. So I'm that makes a lot more sense to me, and I'm happy that you told me, because I mean I'm just, let me stop. But I wanted to ask you, I just wanted to ask you as well, more about gender socialization, because I know that's something you really like to talk about, and that's something that I'm not very familiar with. So I wanted to hear more about it from you.
Gotcha. First of all, thank you for asking these questions. I think that they're important to just hear to talk about, so I appreciate you. And gender socialization is something that I love to talk about because it it dominates just the way we live our life, right? Every little thing, like, and so what about gender socialization do you want me to talk about? Like, do you want me to unpack like our gender boxes, or do you like just kind of overall as a whole how gender socialization affects us?
Well, I mean, however you would talk to it to somebody, because I know it's not a lot of people don't know, and I feel like for people that do know, there are certain layers and levels that you could get into and like unpack, but I think more of just like a grounded approach to like somebody who's just trying to get a better understanding and honestly just know what it is, because I feel like that's what
Gotcha.
a lot of people are in.
Okay, yeah. So, we are socialized by a lot of different things in our life, right? We have a lot of different systems around us that we're raised in. First and foremost, it's our family, right? Our family, our parents socialize us. And then we go to school, and the school reinforces some of that socialization, right? And then maybe if you're religious, you go to temple, you go to church, and that also helps socialize you. And your friends, right? Your peers, and like they also help socialize you. And then there's also the media to help reinforce it, right? And so essentially, when we talk about gender socialization, it's this idea that we exist on a binary, right? We have boy and we have girl. And that is it, right? We have this idea of what a girl is. It's the idea of, oh, we're going to have like a gender reveal party, and we're going to shoot out pink, and we're going to buy her things to be a princess, and we're gonna we might buy her a kitchen set as a kid, right, to play with, and like a magic wand and things like that. And then a boy, and we have boy and we have blue, and we are going to buy him GI Joes, and we are going to like maybe give him science books and things like that. And so essentially gender socialization is this idea that before you're even born, just by the genitalia you possess, you have these inherent, I guess, traits or responsibilities put upon you. And it's damaging. And it's damaging for multiple different reasons, because when an individual then steps outside the box that they're assigned, and that can be in a lot of different ways, right? That could be perhaps like not identifying as either of those boxes, right? Being non-binary, identifying as not a boy or a girl, or even stepping outside the box and perhaps being gay, right? Like men are typically socialized to want women, and so stepping outside of these boxes can be dangerous. It can be dangerous in our society because our society is kind of built upon these boxes. And so what's scary about it is that, like I mentioned before, we get socialized by all these different institutions, and all of these different institutions, perhaps for the most part, maybe not your friends, right? But like school might uphold that. Church might uphold your gender roles. And so gender socialization and gender roles kind of just go hand in hand, and it can just be damaging because we are more than just what is inside a box. We are so much more, and it's really something to think about, to where if we raised people of different genitalia the same way, how would they turn out? And maybe we would be seeing more people, born as women in higher position roles, and maybe we would be seeing more people who are born as males to be feeling their emotions more, to be really touching in. And what's interesting, talking about this, I think it's important to acknowledge toxic masculinity, and how toxic masculinity is something that affects all genders. I think sometimes it gets lost in the noise, where people might get offended, or people might get like, there is talk that's like feminism isn't for everyone, right? Like, what about men? What about the men who are raped? Or what about the men, who are XYZ? And I think that's what's really important, is that toxic masculinity affects everybody, right? It affects the boy who wants to cry. It affects like the girl who wants to play with the GI Joes, who doesn't want to wear a dress, um, just essentially, to boil it all down, is that gender socialization affects us in a lot of different ways, and sometimes they're visual, right? Sometimes we can point at something and say, oh, that's my gender role, right? I, as a woman, belong in the kitchen. We know that is a gender role put upon me. But something we might not think about is how, like ADHD, for example, oftentimes people present as female don't get diagnosed with ADHD, or their ADHD comes out differently because how we socialize the genders. Typically, a boy who has ADHD is going to be loud and talking and bouncing off the walls, right? But that's because we allow boys that space. We allow boys to do that. We don't let little girls run around the store screaming, because that's not ladylike, right? So just in that way, it is like detrimental to how we even diagnose people with, mental illnesses or like disabilities, and so essentially we don't just exist in two boxes. Gender isn't on a binary, it's non-binary, and it's like we just need to move away from these boxes and these roles in order to allow more freedom within ourselves, and amongst each other.
That actually is a good segue into, well, first off, I appreciate everything that you said. I had a lot of stuff going through my head while you were speaking, and I was trying to think of a good follow-up. But now I'm thinking of like the like being non-binary, because that the notion had always confused me a bit, because I never really understood what that meant. And essentially, it's just as you phrased it, like the boxes. It's like stepping out of those boxes and just being like, I'm me. I'm not this, I'm not that. Is that kind of what it is? And pardon my ignorance. I'm in the process of trying to learn more, but this is a good like
Yeah.
starting point.
No, yeah, absolutely. And of course, like, it's no one's fault that they aren't educated on something, right? But what you're doing right now is taking time to ask those questions and to get educated. And I think that is like a great example for people. Yeah. So essentially a non-binary, I'm not the most like super like 100% sealed versed on like LGBTQ issues and like gender like identity perhaps, but yeah, so like non-binary, I feel like it's just not subscribing to like a gender and to what like is put upon you, right? Like it's just not identifying with like my vagina makes me a woman. Like there's so many other things that make me who I am, and I don't necessarily need a gender label, right? Because humans created that. We created the word boy and girl. We saw, like we did that. That's something that is subjective. That's something that's arbitrary. And so, yeah, being non-binary is just not subscribing to those boxes. Yeah.
Okay, understood. That helps me, and I appreciate you explaining it more. And part of my journey in Men Against Violence was being like, oh, not everyone's like me, and
Yeah.
like I I'm not really, I don't like bigotry. I'm not like an inherently ignorant person. I believe, I believe in, equality, and I think, there are a bunch of different levels to certain things. And like when you break it down, it's really fascinating how a lot of things work. And obviously, as you get older, you become more acquainted like with the real world and how things work, and like,
Yeah.
oh wow, this is really messed up for this reason, that reason. So it's fascinating to hear that, because it was like a realization point where it's like, oh, like and this is kind of how I viewed like a lot of stuff after that. It's like I can't really understand what this is like. Like I don't know what it's like to have to go to another state to get an abortion, because it's so hard to get an abortion in this state. That's not something I will ever have to deal with. You know, I may have a partner, like I have a girlfriend now, that may be something, you know, we tackle as a group, but inherently it is more of her problem than it is my problem. So it's just, I feel like that's kind of a problem right now, you know, with like a lot of America, and you know, not to get all deep and, you know, pretentious about it, but I think it's just more importantly that we've become so polarized with our own, like, our own politics and what we believe. And, you know, it's harder, and it becomes harder to have conversations like this, you know. So that's another reason why I appreciate your time and having you, you know. And, you know, coming from like my high school, you know, I didn't have like a bunch of bigoted friends, but they were all in a box, you know. They were all in a box and a certain way of thinking. And, you know, YouTube, Twitter, all this social media stuff just influenced the way people thought. So, you know, I'm gonna become more versed on, like, you know, what it means to be non-binary. And, you know, and I'm now, like, I've starting point and I kind of understand a bit more now. But I wanted to ask you as well, like, on, like, because you had mentioned earlier about like feminism and what feminism means to you and what it's always meant to you, and it's always been a part of your life. But like for a lot of people, and, you know, men and women, you know, some look at like the term feminism as like, you know, it's like men, it's like women thinking they're better than men, and it's like
Mhm.
women versus men. And from what I understand, like feminism is more of like this holistic approach where it's like we are inherently equal. Like, you know, it's not about like we're not getting more. We're not saying you get less, we get more. It's just like let's be on the same footing ground. And, you know, it's just like this combative issue now where a lot of people just see feminism like one of those trendy words, like I said, safety spaces, where it's like, oh, that means this. You know, like people think Black Lives Matter, that means, you know, destroying the streets and rioting and signs, you know. And I just wanted to get your interpretation of, you know, how the word feminism has morphed and how, you know, many people see it differently, and then what the word feminism and what it embodies means to you.
Gotcha. And so, I just had a thought while you were talking about the first thing, the gender thing. Just one last thought on that is, I believe that, and so this is something I tell my family members, right? Where it's like you don't have to completely understand the binary and non-binary and everything in order to respect people, right? So you don't have to understand what a trans woman is, but you should be able to respect that individual enough to use their pronouns when they ask you to use their pronouns, or to ask, or when they ask you to use their chosen name instead of their dead name, right? And so I just think that is something that that is important to think about, is that you don't have to fully understand something in order to respect it, right? And so that's my final thought on that. And I guess that kind of goes into feminism and goes into, you know, Black Lives Matter, and to go into all these things. Something that I find interesting is the way people can weaponize individuals who are asking for rights, right? The way that we the way that individuals have weaponized the Black Lives Matter movement, the way people have weaponized like the word feminism, and how we can look at that anger and kind of maybe think about, why is that person angry? Why is it that some men think the word feminism is attacking them? You know, I think that it's natural for humans that are in power to want to stay in power. And so there's this fear amongst people in our society. There's this fear and this anger that comes from being like, no, well, I earned this, right? I think that's a part of it, of being like, well, it's not because I'm a man that got me to where I'm at. It's because I worked really hard to get to where I'm at, which is, it's privilege, right? I think that privilege is something we don't teach people. We just don't. And people hate to acknowledge their privilege. And I think that for some people, like, it can make them really angry to even think that privilege got them to where they're at, right? And so, and when I say privilege, I mean, like, there are so many different ways in which a person can have privilege. There's this term called intersectionality, created by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 90s. And the term intersectionality is essentially just this idea that we are not just one identity, right? Like I'm a white woman. That's one of my identities, but I'm also bi, right? And so in that intersection, I have woman and I have like LGBTQ. And so, for example, we're also like, like Black women. They're Black, but they're also women. And so with these different intersections can create perhaps more privileges, but it can also create perhaps more oppression, right? And so in society, when it comes to like feminism, yes, like you said it, great. Like we don't want to take away people's rights. That's not what that looks like. What we want to do is say, hey, like, why is it that perhaps like a woman has worked in the same position as a man for longer, but maybe isn't getting promoted the same way? Or why is it that women still are underpaid? As individuals in society, right? As people who grow up in America and, in our culture, we have to acknowledge is inherently sexist. Our culture is inherently racist. Our culture is inherently homophobic. It just is, right? We can look at all these systems. And we can also look and we can pinpoint like ways in which that we're socialized that, back that up. But essentially what we have to do now as adults is unlearn that and unpack that. And some people don't, right? And sometimes you don't unpack your racism, and sometimes you don't unpack your sexism, and you don't unpack your homophobia, but you're also in a position of power, right? So if you don't unlearn these things that are inherent to us, that are our knee-jerk reactions, well then that is how we see a lot of white men in positions of power, or that's why we also see white women over like other identities. And so essentially how I think of feminism is that we just need to take it upon ourselves to unlearn those things and to acknowledge like, hey, history and society has hurt you, but I see you as an equal, right? I don't see you as this inferior thing. I see you as capable and doing something about that. And also I would like to say that like being a feminist also includes like upholding and helping other identities and other marginalized communities, right? Like I think that in order to be a feminist, you also need to support LGBTQ individuals, right? You need to support trans women. You need to support like non-white people, right? It all goes together. Like yes, it all goes together. I hope that made sense.
It does. It makes a tremendous amount of sense. And I've heard criticism of like Taylor Swift, for example, because she's like a fake feminist or a white feminist. And, I'd be like, well, what does that mean? And it makes sense, about like the overlapping of identities. And I think that's kind of another problem is like the privilege thing, because like all the time, my goal, I mean, and, we don't know each other that well, but like my goal, just in life and like, is just to like be, I mean, it changed a little bit. Like I've been growing a lot this past month, so it's changed a bit, but like, I just want to be the best version of myself and just be very successful and, just change like this generation for my family. And, I just want to become like somewhat of like a legend, and I want to work in entertainment, and I want to be a producer, and I want to like create things. But I know that part of my ambition and my goals and like what I want to do is built off of, money and being in middle class and, having the privilege. Like my mom was able to, my parents are divorced. My mom was able to move me here from New York, and, we have a really nice house, and I had a good education. And, I feel like you're right in that you have to acknowledge those things, because I know that, I could be on the streets. I could be like, I just need to make it out alive. And that could be my only goal, and I think, it's like more so like you said about like society. It's, like, people, there's this thing about, fat people and how people view fat people and, different races and, like the halo effect, and like people inherently think that people that are more attractive are more like intelligent, charismatic, and funny. Just like that's like a psychological thing that's just inherent in human beings. So I think that's the first step in acknowledging, where we like why things are the way they are, and like the socialization, because I never really like knew about like that term socialization and how it impacts different things. And I think that kind of brings me to like my next point is like this recent movement of like the hashtag not all men, and like
Yeah.
a lot of guys just trying to say that. And sometimes I felt, I'm like, well, I mean, and it's made me question myself. And it's I don't want to say especially like strained my relationship with my girlfriend, but it's like, am I the problem? Because I've seen a lot of like women, like on Twitter and stuff, and I've learned I've learned to like phase a lot of that out. But it's like, men need to die, like men just go to war and like kill yourself. And
Yeah.
it's tough seeing that all the time. And when you kind of like phase a lot of that out, and you realize it's more of just like, it's certain men, and this happens way more predominantly with men than women, like domestic abuse and rape and all these situations where sometimes you just gotta like shut up and listen. And that's kind of like the approach that I've taken, and just trying to have an open mind and just realize, like we talked about with that you have certain advantages inherently, and there's stuff that I don't have to deal with that you may have to deal with, just because of what's in between our wet legs. So I just want to hear your thoughts on this recent like not all men movement that's been occurring recently, like on social media.
Gotcha. So the interesting thing about privilege, right? And the cool thing about once you can acknowledge your privilege, you can use that, right, to help other individuals who don't have that privilege. And so essentially, um, this idea of women are afraid of all men, it's funny because like again, like we can think about also the socialization. We can think about how I it's interesting to think if you are an individual who is born a man and you still identify as a man, right? You're cis, and you can think about how you're raised. And this is something that I'm curious, if listeners are like people to think about, where it's like, how often in your life have you been told how to protect yourself, right? And again, this is important because there are some intersections, right? Like perhaps like a black male might be raised by his mom telling him certain things to do with the cops, that's one thing. But in general, it's like, how are men raised to think about their own safety versus how are people who are born um, a female and can continue identifying as that, like are raised with like pepper spray, or are raised with don't wear that to the party, or like there are so many ways just from the get-go, from how like when we're born, that I think bring us to using the words all men. Because on one hand you have to think about how we are almost raised to be afraid of all men, right? We were raised to have pocket knives. We're raised to have pepper spray. We're raised to be not alone at night. You can't go on a jog in the middle of the night. That's super dangerous. Oh, like you can't wear that skirt out because that could be dangerous, right? And so in general in us, it's instilled to have this fear. And so there is, right? Of course, common sense tells you not every single man is going to attack me. Not every single man is a perpetrator, right? But inherently, a lot of men are, right? Statistically, men commit a lot of crimes. And so it's one of those things, like, and I've seen a lot of tweets and whatnot that have a lot of really good analogies of like, okay, well, like, if there's one Skittle in a bowl of a bunch of Skittles that's poisonous, that would make you skeptical to put your hand in that bowl, wouldn't it? And so it's this, and I can understand how, as a person who presents as a man, could be like offended, by our XYZ and all men or blah, blah, blah. But in reality, if we take a second to push past that, right, to push past that anger and maybe think about why it is, like, why is it that perhaps a woman is afraid of me walking down the street, I think a lot of this goes back on our systems that socialize us, but also onto men, because women and LGBTQ individuals can't be the only people having these conversations, right? Like saying, hey, don't say that about a woman, or hey, like, don't touch my butt in the club, right? Like, I can't be the only one doing that. It also needs to be men, right? It needs to be the friend of the guy who grabbed the butt at the club needs to say, hey, that's not cool, right? There needs to be accountability amongst the identity that's committing the most, rape, and that's committing the most abuse, that's committing the most of this thing, to have conversations amongst each other and say, hey, dude, like, please don't talk about that person like that, And so I think that's also where it comes to, is using the privilege as a man to say and have those conversations, and to no longer allow that, right? To no longer allow that behavior amongst each other. And also, like, going back to socialization, we also, like, we need to raise boys and girls the same way. We need to raise, like, are the same way of saying, like, hey, you have a right to your own body. You do, period, point blank. You have a right to get to wear, like, revealing clothing out, right? Because that's your body, and that's beautiful, and that's fantastic, and you have that right. And if somebody impeded upon that right, well, then somebody needs to be held accountable. And I think what's hard in our society is that we don't have a lot of that ladder, right? We give girls the pepper spray, but if something happens, well, we also want to investigate, okay, well, you were wearing that skirt, right? Like, where you, like, know those things could happen. We don't put a lot of ownership on men. We just don't. And so I think that's also where the conversation is happening, and that's also, I think, where a lot of the anger is coming from individuals, of saying, like, oh, because they're hurt, right? They're also hurt by this system who's continuously not protecting them, right? They're just not being protected. And that is to say, for a lot of identities, right? Trans women are the, like, that identity is the most murdered in our country. But, like, we don't talk about that, right? And it's scary, because those individuals also just aren't being protected. And so, with all that to say, not all men, but it makes sense to say all men, because you don't know which guy, right? You don't know which one. I can understand both sides, right? I think it's understandable for men potentially not wanting or being open to learning, when people say all men, right? I could see how that could be off-putting, how that could be like, well, I don't want to listen to you because you automatically think I'm this evil person, right? Right, like, if you actually want to have a real conversation with an individual, then you shouldn't start that conversation like that, right? If you want to create real change, you don't start that conversation like that. But also at the same time, I'm also a big advocate for not telling people how to have their feelings hurt. It's not my place to tell perhaps a woman, or to tell, like, an LGBTQ person, or to tell, like, a non-white person how to carry their pain of society. Like, who am I to say, okay, I get where you're coming from, but it's being really mean. When in reality, like, the systems have been being mean to all these identities the whole time. So they're allowed to be angry. They're allowed to be angry. And that's why I think is a cool thing about activism, is a cool thing about this world, is that we need the angry individuals the same way we need the patient individuals who open up conversations, that are calm, and who want to reach across the aisle and want to have those conversations. But we also need the people who protest, and we also need the people who are, like, calling it out. You know what I mean? It's like, it's like multiple cogs in a machine, that I think are important.
That makes sense. I find it interesting you're saying that, like, it's also important that we have the ladder. I've never heard that before, and I could see it, like, as an approach where it's like, they, like, contribute in a way that, like, without, we need them, because, like, it's like they, in order to change, like, everything, we need to educate them and, like, listen to them. And I've never heard that before, and I find it interesting, as well as, like, the part about pain, and, like, it's not like, I can't say, like, you're overreacting, you're underreacting, because everyone reacts differently, and it's like, it is what it is. It's like, I can't tell you you're wrong. I mean, that's really fascinating to me. We are almost out of time, so I'm gonna leave you with one last question, which I'm curious about. But what was your major?
My major, you're gonna love this, journalism.
What? And okay, and after now having been part of this organization, Students Against
Mhm.
Violence, formerly Men Against Violence, for um, your whole college career, correct? Because you were a senior now.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a senior.
So, what do you want to do with the future and after you graduate?
So something I very much love and appreciate about this organization is that to some people they might potentially could say we are saying things that are controversial. But the truth of the matter is, like, we do a lot of research. Like, I have office hours, like, I work in an office, and like, before I present on anything, I do my research. And so I find objective, true information, right? The statistics we have are credible. The information we have is credible. So as a journalist, like, this is the perfect opportunity, right? This is the perfect thing where like I'm gonna take what I've learned in just knowing these things, right? Knowing how to research, but also like knowing my position as a journalist. And what's really cool about any job, right, is that you have the potential to help change society, right? So as a journalist, like I can take what I've learned and perhaps like know how to tell a story of a victim without perhaps like exploiting them, or I can choose to interview like a diverse range of sources. So my goal is to be a journalist. My goal is to tell people stories, and my goal is to also continue to educate, because education is such an important mode for change. And as what I think is beautiful about being a journalist is that, like, we're gatekeepers of society. Like, if you go back and if you want to know what the 50s are like, you might read a news article. And so I want to help reflect our society. I want to help educate our society so that it can be better, and so that we can just get information out there. That inherently was the reason why I chose journalism, was because of like learning about like muckrackers and like yellow journalism and like Upton Sinclair. I was like, that is literally so cool. Like, a journalist wrote a story about the food industry, and we got laws created to help change that just because people didn't know about it. And so that's what I would like to do. That my time with Students Against Violence has just given me so many tools in my tool belt to help tell people stories in a lot, in just a more articulate way.
Threw me off of that one. I was not expecting you to say journalism. That was a shocker. I mean, regardless, I appreciate your time. It was a truly authentic conversation, and I appreciate, you educating me and having a dialogue. And, I think we can use more of this, just like in general as a
Yeah.
whole, and educating one another. So I'm very grateful for your time. Um, I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
being on Sit Down.
Yeah, I'm also appreciative of you. Thank you for asking these questions and for, helping educate the world.
Look, you did most of the heavy lifting. But regardless, this has been fun. That's it for this week's Star Sit Down. We'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Bye.